When Princess Diana died in the summer of 1997, a lot of people quietly assumed the same thing. They assumed the grief would fade. They thought the flowers outside the palace would stop coming, the tears would dry, and that in time she would settle into a history book the way most famous people eventually do. A sad chapter, a face from another decade. 27 years later, the surprising thing is just how wrong that assumption turned out to be. Because what happened in the years after her death wasn't a slow fading at all. It was the opposite. The woman the world lost in a tunnel in Paris somehow kept growing larger in memory, not smaller. The causes she cared about kept winning, long after she was gone to fight for them. And the way she did things, the way she treated people, ended up changing the most famous family in the world in ways nobody could have predicted at the time. Before we get into it, if you find these stories worth your time, take a second to subscribe. It really does help. Now let's talk about what actually happened. To understand why 27 years later still surprises people, you have to go back to how it ended and how it began. She was 36 years old when she died. On the 31st of August, 1997, the car she was traveling in crashed in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in central Paris. She had been chased through the city by photographers on motorbikes, the same kind of attention that had followed her almost every day for 16 years. By the time the news reached the rest of the world, it was the middle of the night in Britain, and people woke up to something that felt impossible. The most photographed woman alive was simply gone. What came next is still hard to describe to anyone who didn't live through it. People who had never met her, who had only ever seen her on a television screen or the front of a magazine, broke down as if they had lost someone in their own family. The grounds outside Kensington Palace, where she had lived, slowly disappeared under a sea of flowers. People queued for hours just to sign a book of condolence. Strangers stood in the street and cried together. It was a kind of public grief the country had never really seen before, and it caught everyone off guard, including the royal family itself. Her funeral was held on the 6th of September 1997 at Westminster Abbey. Around 2.5 billion people watched it around the world. Think about that number for a moment. At the time, it was one of the most watched events in the history of television, more than most royal weddings, more than most coronations. Two of the people walking behind her coffin that day were her sons. Prince William was 15. Prince Harry was just 12. Two boys on the worst day of their lives, walking slowly through the streets of London while the whole planet watched. She was buried in the end somewhere quiet, at Althorpe, the Spencer family estate where she had grown up, on a small island in the middle of a lake, reachable only by boat. After all the noise and the cameras and the crowds, she was finally given the one thing she had struggled to find in life: privacy. And here is where most people expected the story to end. A tragic life, a shocking death, a beautiful funeral, and then the slow quiet of history. But that's not what happened. The first sign that this was going to be different came almost immediately, and it came from a cause she had taken up in the final year of her life. In January of 1997, just months before she died, Diana had done something that a lot of people around her thought was risky and strange. She traveled to Angola, a country torn apart by years of war, and she walked through a live minefield. She wore body armor and a clear visor over her face, and she stepped carefully along a narrow, cleared path while cameras followed her. The landmines buried in that ground had been left behind by the fighting, and they were still killing and maiming ordinary people, including children, years after the war itself had ended. A lot of powerful people were not happy with her for doing this. Landmines were a sensitive political subject, and a princess walking through a minefield to draw attention to them was seen by some as her getting involved in things that weren't her business. She didn't back down. Later that same year, she visited Bosnia for the same reason, meeting survivors who had lost their legs to these weapons, sitting with them, listening to them, holding their hands. Then she died, and many assumed the cause would die with her. Instead, in December of 1997, Only a few months after her funeral, more than 100 countries gathered and signed a treaty to ban anti-personnel landmines. The agreement, sometimes called the Ottawa Treaty, became one of the most important steps the world ever took against those weapons. Nobody can prove exactly how much one person changed the outcome. But the people who were in those rooms, the campaigners who had spent years pushing for it, will tell you that the sight of Diana walking through that field gave their cause something they could never have bought. The eyes of the entire world. She had taken a subject that most people found boring and technical and made millions of ordinary people care about it overnight. That alone would be a remarkable legacy. But it was just one piece of something much bigger, and the bigger thing was about how she treated people. Go back 10 years before her death to 1987. At that time, there was a disease that the world was terrified of and did not understand. Many people believed wrongly that you could catch it just by touching someone who had it. Patients were treated like they were dangerous. They were isolated, avoided, sometimes abandoned by their own families. Diana visited a hospital ward for people living with that illness. And in front of the cameras, without gloves, she reached out and shook the hand of a man who was dying from it. It seems like such a small thing now, a handshake. But in that moment, with that one simple gesture, she told the entire world that these were human beings who deserved to be touched, comforted, and treated with dignity. People who had been too frightened to even sit near someone with the disease saw a princess hold a patient's bare hand, and something shifted. Doctors and campaigners later said it did more to change public attitudes than years of careful explaining ever could. She didn't give a speech. She just refused to be afraid, and she let people see it. That was the thing about her that turned out to matter most. It wasn't the dresses, though the world was obsessed with them. It wasn't the fairy tale wedding back in 1981, watched by hundreds of millions, that everyone slowly realized had not been a fairy tale at all. It was the way she got down to the level of a sick child and looked them in the eye. The way she hugged people the rules said she shouldn't hug. The way she spoke openly in a famous television interview about her own unhappiness, her own struggles, things that people in her position were simply never supposed to admit. For most of its history, the British monarchy had survived by keeping its distance, by staying formal, controlled, and a little bit cold. Never explain, never complain. Diana did the opposite of all of it. She let people see that she was hurting. She cried. She admitted she had problems. And a huge part of the public loved her even more for it because it made her feel real in a way royalty almost never had. Many people at the time thought this would be forgotten as soon as she was gone, that the institution would simply return to the way it had always been. It didn't. And that is one of the things that genuinely surprised people in the years that followed. Slowly, the family she had married into began to change in her direction. The stiff, distant style softened. Younger members started talking openly about difficult things, about grief, about mental health, about the pressure of the life they were born into. They began doing the kind of warm, hands-on charity work that she had made her own. You can argue about how much of that was her direct influence and how much was simply the world changing. But anyone who remembers how things were before 1997 and looks at how they are now can see the shape of her in it. And then there were her sons. When those two boys walked behind their mother's coffin in 1997, the world ached for them and quietly wondered how they would ever recover. The answer, which unfolded over the next 2.5 decades, was its own kind of surprise. Both of them grew up and picked up the work she had left unfinished. They built charities. They worked with the homeless, with sick children, with people struggling in silence with their own minds. And in one moment that felt almost like the story closing a circle, Prince Harry traveled to Angola in 2019, the same country his mother had visited, and he walked through the very same ground she had walked through more than 20 years before. Except now it was no longer a minefield. The danger had been cleared away. Where she had once stepped carefully past hidden explosives, there was now a street with shops and people and ordinary life. He walked it for her, and for everyone who could now walk it safely because of the attention she had drawn all those years earlier. The brothers haven't always agreed. In the years that followed, the two of them grew apart in ways that were painful and very public, and a lot of people found that sad precisely because they remembered those two small boys holding it together on the day of the funeral. But even in their differences, you can see the same inheritance. Both of them, in their own ways, kept trying to use their position to help people, the way she had taught them. In 2021, on what would have been her 60th birthday, William and Harry came together to unveil a statue of their mother in the gardens of Kensington Palace, the home where she had lived and where the flowers had once piled up after her death. Whatever distance had grown between them, for that one day they stood side by side for her. The statue shows her with 3 children, meant to represent the universal quality of her care, the way she seemed to belong not just to her own family, but to people everywhere. Which brings us back to the surprise at the center of all this. 27 years after she died, the world did not move on the way it usually does. On the anniversary of her death in 2024, people still came. They still gathered at the gates of Kensington Palace and covered them with flowers and photographs and handwritten notes, just as their parents had done a generation before. In Paris, near the tunnel where she died, a golden flame sculpture that was never even meant to be about her has quietly become her unofficial memorial, and people still leave tributes there too. Children who were not even born when she died now know her face, her story, her name. That is the thing that surprised everyone. Fame usually fades. The famous die and the world grieves, and then within a few years the grief softens into something more like a fact in a textbook. It happens to almost everyone, no matter how loved they were. It did not happen to her. Why not? Why does a woman who died in 1997 still pull crowds and tears in a completely different age? An age of phones and the internet she never lived to see. The honest answer seems to be this: people did not love her for being a princess. There have been many princesses, and most of them are remembered only as names. They loved her because she made strangers feel seen. Because when she looked at someone, whether it was a dying patient, a frightened child, or a survivor who had lost everything, that person felt, for a moment, like they were the only one in the room. That feeling does not fade with time. The people she touched told their children. Their children told their own. And so the memory keeps renewing itself, passing down through families like something handed from one set of hands to the next. The flowers, the causes that outlived her, the family she quietly reshaped, the sons who carried her work forward, the strangers who still cry at her gate after all these years. None of it was guaranteed. All of it could have faded. The truly surprising thing about the 27 years since Princess Diana's death is that the world kept choosing, again and again, not to let her go. So here is the question worth sitting with for a moment. We remember kings for their power, and we remember the powerful for what they built. But the person the world has refused to forget all these years was remembered for something much simpler than any of that. She was remembered for being kind to people who had nothing to give her back. Maybe that tells us something about what actually lasts. Not the crown, not the fame, just the way you made people feel when it would have been easier not to bother. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments which part stayed with you the most. And subscribe so the next one finds its way to you. Thank you for watching.